worshiper, then you know that it demands everything you have and everything you are to be a true worshiper. Had to do it. So the first example, let's turn to the 4th chapter of the book of Genesis real quick. Because this is the first recorded instance of worship. I'm not saying this is the first worship that took place, but I'm saying it's the first worship that took place that's recorded for us. And in this particular narrative, we've had 2 people that are the focus up to this point in time, and now we've got 2 other people. Who's the first 2 people? Adam and Eve, and it just so happens the next 2 people happen to be their offspring, Cain and Abel, okay? Now, there's some indication here. Of course, we know that Abel and Cain were born, and some have taken the word guessed, and this is just a suggestion, that they were twins, and that Abel was born first, and then Cain was born. Now, I don't see any indication where that's false. I don't see any indication, at least in my understanding of Hebrew, which is none, that that's required, but that's a possibility. It really doesn't matter one way or another, okay? If they were years apart in being born, then some would start arguing as to the greater degree of teaching that was available to Abel instead of Cain. But we don't know that. We just don't know that. But nonetheless, we have 2 different results from worship that was engaged in here. In the process of time, Cain brought of the fruit of the ground and offered to the Lord. Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof an offering to the Lord. And lo and behold, God responded differently to these 2 boys' worship. As a matter of fact, the text tells us that God had respect unto Abel in his sacrifice, but unto Cain in his sacrifice, he didn't have respect. See, the very first instance of worship recorded shows us there's a difference between worships. That there can be 2 different kinds of worship. There can be a worship that is accepted, a worship that is enjoyed, is appreciated by God, and then there's a worship that doesn't fit that criteria. It's not respected. And neither is the one who's doing the worshiping respected. Well, what's the difference here, reckon? Well, I am so thankful that every question that people have come up with is most of the time answered in a particular passage of Scripture later on in Scripture. And it just so happens we have an example in Hebrews chapter 11, which we refer to as the Hall of Fame of the Faithful, that we find out what faith involves from the very beginning to the very end. Faith involves hearing what God says do, trusting God to be telling us the truth, and doing what He says for us to do so that we might receive the blessings that go along with believing and obeying. Every example from the very beginning is like that. And so we read in verse 4 of Hebrews chapter 11, by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. Little old simple statement made there. By faith Abel offered a more excellent, a better sacrifice. Well, that implies that the distinction between Abel's sacrifice and Cain's was not by faith. If Abel's sacrifice was by faith and Cain's sacrifice was not by faith, then that's the difference. So what does that imply necessarily? That implies that God told them what to do in worship. Abel heard what God said and did it. Cain heard what God said and did what he wanted to do. That's it. Now, friends, there are people assembled in buildings today and tonight and yesterday and all the time who refuse to see that significant point right there in the 4th chapter of the book of Genesis. They refuse to. When you do not do what you're doing and calling it worship without Bible authority, that is the exact same example that we have here pictured by Cain. God told him what to do. Cain says, I'm going to do something else. Now, interesting in that situation there, Cain gets upset because it says that his countenance was fallen. Now, There's a lot involved in that. Did he look like he was mad? Did he look like he was pouting? Evidently, although God could read his heart, then it seems to indicate that he's seeing this fella here who's all bent out of shape for some reason. He says, what's wrong? What's wrong with you, Cain? Now, if you did good, you'd be accepted. But if you do not do good, then sin lieth at the door. In other words, as I've oftentimes said, God's basically telling Cain here, you better nip it in the bud. You better stop right here, because if you don't, it's going to get worse than it is right now. So far, you've just engaged in unauthorized worship. But if you don't realize that the reason that this distinction has been made by me is your fault, it's not Abel's fault, it's not God's fault, it's Cain's refusal to recognize what Abel saw clearly, and that is to do what God said do, for the reason it's Cain's refusal to recognize what Abel saw clearly, and that is to do what God said do, for the reason God said do it. And the blessings were, verse 4, that the blood of Abel speaks today concerning that very event. I mean, here we are all these years later, and we're using the example of Cain and Abel to show that true worship involves determination, following God's instruction, worshiping God in a manner that's reverential to show respect to him in accordance with the truth. And Cain didn't do that. So that's pretty obvious. Pretty obvious. When people use as their supposed justification what they do in worship with, well, I really like that, that's not sufficient. If a person says, well, everybody else is doing that, that's not sufficient. What ultimately comes down to, and the reason why people do those things that they do in worship without biblical authority, is because they like it and they want to and they do it. That's it. Which is exactly what Cain did.